Hello, and welcome to the World History Addicts Podcasts, a show where we discuss history and global politics through a social and anthropological lens. Today I will be talking with my co-host Nick about the Cold War, what it was all about, and why the United States won.
Or did they win?
Let's begin.
So, Devin, how's it going?
Pretty well, Nick, I have to say.
Yeah, it's only been it's been about a week since we last saw each other.
Yeah,
recorded
how time flies.
Yeah, we recorded episode 6,
Yeah,
right,
that
last
was
week?
episode 6.
All about the when did the modern world begin? People should go ahead and
yeah.
check that out.
Definitely check that one out. Yeah, and at the end of that episode, I said, check out the next episode, which is this episode, about America winning the Cold War.
Yeah, and that I guess that could just lead us straight in. I mean, Devin, why did America win the Cold War, or did they?
Good question. And before I answer that, I'm going to have to clarify first what the Cold War was, because I think it's not as well understood as, say, like World War II or even World War I. It's a very complex kind of deal. It lasted for much longer because, World War II lasted from, 1937, if you stretch the definition of where it started, to 1945, so 8 years. And World War I was 1914 to 1918, so only 4 years. But the Cold War lasted from the 1940s all the way into the early 1990s.
Okay.
So almost 50 years right there.
Amazing.
Very different kind of time scale. So what the Cold War was a roughly 50-year struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that didn't become a direct military conflict. If they did, we wouldn't be standing here. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it because I don't think we'd even exist.
Totally.
Yeah, so both states, the Soviets and the Americans, had a vast worldwide global alliance network, and that allowed them to fight each other by supporting proxy states, terrorists, rebels, really any possible way to destabilize the other side. The reason being is that by that point they had both of them had nuclear weapons. They had the doctrine of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, which basically meant that the moment one side launched missiles, the other side could just retaliate, and both would get destroyed, and both sides would lose. So they didn't do that.
And that was like an actual, we'll call it policy, or what do you call it, doctrine? Or
yeah, I called it a doctrine, but it was just the military and the political policy for both sides, because they knew really quickly that nuclear war would be inevitable if any of them actually either of them went too far. It will just end up with both of them getting destroyed.
Scary stuff.
Yeah, and not only was it a military buildup, because of course there was the increasing buildup of nuclear arms and missiles and delivery systems and like submarines, so that one side couldn't just launch a decapitation strike and just take out the other side and prevent any retaliation, because even if you were to destroy the entire mainland, there would still be nuclear missiles with orders to shoot if they got word that the mainland had been nuked.
Yeah, that's a really interesting that's like I've heard that the people who I guess are in charge of carrying out the order of firing a nuclear missile, they have to, they have no choice essentially, they have to do it regardless of whether or not, I guess, whether they feel it's the correct decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's all about the deterrence. Because ideally, no one would have to shoot the nuclear bombs, because no one would actually be hit with them in the first place. No side would launch them. So, and they would keep each other in a kind of Armageddon equilibrium in a paradoxical kind of way.
Yeah, weird how this is all just in the mind. It all exists in everyone's mind. Like you said, the ultimate deterrent. It's wild.
Yeah. And it was also a time of non-military competition. There was pop culture, there was soft power, there was lots of music coming out in that era.
Yeah.
But there's also technological, what do they call it, competition, like the space race. That was probably the most widespread and the one that was the largest spectacle, because everyone was tuning in to seeing the first man on the moon. That was a huge event, probably one of the biggest events of the 20th century, other than World War II itself.
Totally, yeah. It's wild to think that all of these things came out of a competition, right? All these things in pop culture and music.
Competition certainly drives change and often progress too, but not always for the best, because it also got the world very, very close to being destroyed during this era. Yeah, so it was also an ideological conflict between the Western world, which was liberal and capitalist, and the Eastern Bloc, which was socialist and communist.
Yeah, what do you? I know we've brushed on this in prior episodes, but just for any new listeners or anybody who may be curious, what do you mean by liberalism? Right, that's kind of a loaded word nowadays in this political climate. But what is the actual meaning of the word?
Well, liberal means it can mean social liberalism, like just being more tolerant and more accepting of more just people in society. But it can also mean economic liberalism, which is the idea that it's like if you're good at making money, you should be allowed to do that, even at the expense of other people and even your own country, if taken to the extreme.
Yeah, and I think it's important to distinguish between when we say it on this podcast, it's more so in that realm of it being a bigger idea that it really takes in both right wing and left, not left, but like what am I trying to say? Like in the scope of the big umbrella of liberalism, you get liberals and conservatives. They're both on the liberal spectrum. Is that correct?
I mean, if we're just looking at it through economics, then I would contend that all conservatives are just economic liberals.
Totally.
You know, we all believe in private property. We all believe in the right for corporations to make money, even if it does start to push into other people's freedom or even the national interest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, there's the Western democracies that are mostly based on liberal ideas, and then you got the Eastern democracies that are based more on rebellious anti-colonial ideas, like those in like say Africa that had just recently gotten their freedom from some European empire.
Right.
And it should be noted, though, that both sides also supported factions and some states that didn't align with them ideologically. Like the Soviets backed the Ugandans under Idi Amin, even though Amin didn't have any real coherent ideology other than him just effectively being the god emperor of Uganda.
Absolutely.
And they also backed Palestinians, and I don't believe most of them were Marxist-Leninists. Many of them weren't even communists. They were just freedom fighters trying to get a free Palestine. And then the U.S. in turn also backed many South American dictatorships that could even be considered fascist, like the Pinochet regime in Chile. And they also backed the Mujahideen, who were Islamic fundamentalists, who themselves are not really liberals.
Yeah.
And the crazy one is that they actually sided with China towards the end of the Cold War in order to use them as like a wedge against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Even though the Chinese at this point were also communists.
Wow.
So when looked at through that angle, I think the Cold War was really a long and kind of unconventional struggle between two super states or two superpowers or empires in that way.
Would we say this was a bipolar world order?
Yes, it absolutely is. I think this was probably the most dangerous bipolar conflict in world history.
If anyone listening has not heard our first episode on multipolarity, you know what to do. Pause this and go listen to that right now.
Yeah. So if we look at it from that way, that it was really a battle between two empires or two superpowers, then the outcome of the Cold War really wasn't a victory for liberalism over communism, even though you can definitely view it that way. But it's really a victory of the United States as a nation over the Soviet Union, a rival competing nation.
Okay. But obviously that didn't just kill communism, right?
I mean, there are many countries today that, well, not many, but there's still a few countries today. Like China is still under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, though how communist they are today with regards to all the corporations is kind of questionable.
Yeah.
There is still Cuba. I mean, they're definitely still in that camp. The Vietnamese are still there. The Laotians are still there too. And of course, there are also many groups that don't have their own state, but they're still very active, like in Latin America.
Totally.
Interestingly, I think you could argue the same for fascism because today there are no openly fascist states, but they do still follow some very similar ideologies. Like today you got the military junta in Myanmar, which I think you could kind of argue is pretty fascistic. And of course, like even here in America, you have lots of activists who, even if they don't call themselves that, that's kind of what they are.
Yeah, that would be an interesting deep dive on just kind of like what exactly is fascism, because I feel like it's just a loaded word, and people, once they hear that word, they kind of get turned off to the whole conversation. But I feel that that's important, especially seeing it as it's on the rise, in our current political landscape, and we should know what these words are, and we should know what they mean. You know.
Yeah, I should actually make an entirely new episode
yeah.
on that at some point in the future.
And spoiler alert, I don't think there's really any one definition for it. I think it depends on who you ask.
Yeah, it's a really broad kind of movement with lots of kind of disjointed fragments of their own movements.
Okay, so then given all that kind of background, I mean, why do you think the United States is still here and the Soviet Union is not? Like, can you kind of point to some reasons, or what would you have to say to that?
Well, there are lots of different reasons as to why the U.S. won out in the end. There isn't like one single reason. But there are some myths I think we can debunk about why the U.S. won and why the West won. So the first myth is that capitalism is just perfect and it's a superior system in every possible way. And I mean, there's certainly lots of merit to it because they have been able to produce a lot of wealth over the centuries. But at the same time, the Soviet Union also increased the standards of living for the average former peasant in the Russian Empire pretty drastically as well. So they were also capable of great progress. And I forget exactly how long it took, but the Soviets took control of basically an agrarian nation and turned it into a nuclear superpower. I think in under 50 years, probably maybe under 40 or 30 years even. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other myth is that the Soviets lost just because they were all evil and stupid, which is, I mean, kind of stupid itself. Because
No, honestly, man, you still hear that kind of problem. Here's the thing: one of the long-lasting effects of the Cold War, and I think McCarthyism was like way like back in the 20s, right? Like Red Scare propaganda. Like we still are getting that heavy today, right? And a lot of it's based on just myths and like really ignorant stuff that, again, we just get bulldozed with, I feel. But why weren't the Soviets evil
to be
and
entirely
incompetent?
fair, politicians in general are kind of evil and stupid, so that applies across the board.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so then why were the Soviets not all evil and incompetent?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Russia has always had issues with corruption and often really brutal authoritarian leaders, regardless of what economic system or government system or ideology they're under. I mean, just look at the Tsars before the Soviets got into power, like even centuries before that. I mean, even what's his name? Peter the Great was a very forward-thinking guy, but even then, he was still an authoritarian leader. He forced his reforms at gunpoint on the rest of the country.
Easily.
Yeah, and. What was I going to say? And today we still have Vladimir Putin, so communism is gone, but the same type of power structure is still there. So I don't find that entirely convincing that it was all just communists who brought all that there. So it wasn't just because of that. And also let's keep in mind that the USSR is a major reason why the Nazis were defeated. So their evil and incompetence certainly had limits because they still won many of the battles on the Eastern Front, and they stopped the Germans from creating a new Aryan empire in Europe.
This reminds me, have you seen that meme? It's like the Olympic people standing on like the pedestals, and you have like number one at the very top is like the Soviets, and then you've got like someone else, and then at the very bottom you have the United States, and they have their third place medal, and they're just breaking champagne and like going nuts, like claiming the victory. Anyways, okay, so
and I think the last myth was that just this kind of idea that freedom always wins.
Totally.
Which I mean, there's the Whig school of history that says that democracy is kind of inevitable and that over time, it may take a very long time, but eventually everyone will live under democracy and that dictatorships will all eventually just dissolve away.
Interesting.
But let's not forget that the U.S. supported many dictatorships during the Cold War, some very nasty dictatorships, and they still won. So, I mean, did freedom really win with the victory of the U.S.?
Right, you almost became what you were accusing the other of being.
Yeah, they supported Chile, the Guatemalan dictatorship. South Korea was actually a dictatorship, believe it or not, up until fairly recently. There's Zaire, which is present-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. Spain under Franco, I think he was one of the longest living dictators in Europe.
Yeah.
Pakistan, Argentina, Brazil actually had a military junta up until the 80s. The Dominican Republic, he was what's his name? Rafael Trujillo was a really mean guy.
Yeah.
It got to the point where the CIA had to eliminate him just because he was starting to get out of control.
Yeah, man. And I sorry to interrupt, but like even just thinking about like Guatemala, Cuba, a lot of the South America, like Chile, like when you look into the details of what happened, how these people democratically elected their leaders, and then just because those leaders did not align with the special interests of the United States, like they go in and really horrible things happened. It was really, really just sad. And for anyone who cares, they can look into that themselves, right? But I don't know. I just thought I'd throw that out there. Like this is like really nasty stuff that was going on.
Yeah,
like
there's the
not to put it lightly,
Yeah, they supported the dictatorship in Paraguay, and they actually supported Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Believe it or not, they were actually the ones who gave him all the weapons that eventually were used against the U.S. in not one but two different Gulf Wars.
Mm-hmm. Why did it ended up? What made them turn on that?
You mean what made them turn against Saddam? Or
Yeah, exactly.
I think part of it was probably that he just wasn't all that useful, and I think it was also that, like Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, he was just starting to get out of control. He was kind of a loose cannon in a way. There's that, and also domestically during the 40s to about the 60s, there was there was segregation, and it wasn't all that democratic for many Americans if they weren't white. And also there's COINTELPRO in the 60s, which I guess you could argue is kind of America's secret police force.
Yeah, the counterintelligence program. That's what it stood for. COINTELPRO. Yeah, that's also some nasty stuff. Okay, well then, so here we are, right? We live in America. America is synonymous with freedom and liberty, right? Why would the U.S. back dictators, right? Like that does. First of all, I'm sure there's just a lot of people who are just flat out deny that, but why would they? What? There's got to be a logical reason for this, right? Why not let these people, these countries that are a lot smaller than us and weaker than us, quote unquote, like why not let them decide what to do with their own countries?
Because it suited their interests geopolitically. The dictatorships who the U.S. supported were generally anti-communist, or sometimes, I guess, in like Idi Amin's case on the Soviet side, they just had no real allegiance to any ideology, so they could just be bought off. In other cases, it was more about economics, because if they were truly independent, then they could start claiming their own resources. They could nationalize the industries, and it would become very difficult for American companies to make a profit from it.
Yeah.
So it was also business driven. And it should also be kept in mind that America's intelligence and military system is set up to defend American freedom, not the freedom of every single country around the world.
Yeah.
So,
for freedom or else. That's
exactly.
what I've written here.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, man, that's a lot of stuff. I mean, I know you talked about some myths about why some of the myths about why the U.S. won the Cold War, but are there any real tangible, like, good examples of why the Soviets lost out and why the U.S. prevailed?
Yeah, the first one is that America was already in a very good position at the end of the war, because, I mean, going all the way back to the 1700s, that's when America began. And ever since then, they had expanded and built up industry. They definitely got to their Industrial Revolution far before the Russians or Soviets ever did. And they also had a much more stable system. Like, even counting the Civil War, there's just much more political stability within the United States. Like the Union still won the Civil War. The Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist system, and even before that, it was a very tumultuous kind of system. Like before the 1917 revolution, there was the 1905 revolution.
You're talking about in Russia, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Russia. And before that, there was all these waves of like assassinations across Russia. Like I think the first suicide bombers were actually Russian anarchists.
Whoa,
they weren't
okay.
Islamists. They were far left. I think the term for them was nihilists, actually, because they just rejected all forms of authority within Russia.
Really? It was the original nihilists.
Yeah, there are groups called, I think, like People's Will, who are just against any form of Tsarist authority.
Interesting.
And so
Man.
they just blew up state officials.
That's pretty hardcore. Okay.
Yeah, and the other reason is the West. The U.S. is part of the Western world, and the West went through many different developments, like the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution that I just mentioned, which gave it a huge edge over Russia. I mean, even if Russia hadn't gone down the road of communism, they still would have had many problems. And I mean, they did, like during World War I. The Russians performed really poorly against the Germans on the Eastern Front, to the point that they actually had to drop out of the war.
Okay.
And before that, in 1904 to 5, I think, the Russians actually fought a war against Japan, which at that point in time, the consensus was that if a European nation goes up against an Asian country, whether that's Middle Eastern or South Asian or East Asian, the European one just wins by default. But in the Russo-Japanese War, that didn't happen.
Okay.
The Japanese crushed their navy, and then they were able to stop their army too. And that's actually the reason why the 1905 revolution went down, because the people were just outraged that their government could have screwed up that badly.
It's also wild that we've talked about this I think on episode 5. It was land versus sea, air powers, different advantages to having different types of armies. Because you think of Russia, how big it is. Like, obviously, this is just like land mass, but like I picture Russia, how big it is, and I picture small Japan, and Japan essentially just winning. Like how, right?
Yeah.
But it's all.
Yeah, I think the way I kind of see it is that it's not just the volume; it's also the density. Because Japan was just much more dense industrially.
Yeah,
and it was just much more efficient. In Russia's case, they had a lot of land, but not as much industry. So I think they actually did have some amount of industry. It just wasn't enough, and it wasn't. I think they just weren't able to transport their troops easily enough to actually fight the Japanese, because they were fighting them all the way out in Siberia, at pretty much the far reaches of the Russian Empire.
Wow,
which put a lot of strain on the logistics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another interesting one is national cohesion, because, I mean, even though America has many issues with its diversity, and there are also plenty of regional differences, like the ones that we saw during the Civil War, it's still much better integrated than the USSR was, because the Soviet Union included many smaller nations that didn't actually want to be there.
Okay.
Like, let's say the Baltic nations, some nations in the Caucasus. I mean, Kazakhstan is independent today. And of course, there's also the Eastern Bloc, which I think was a much more kind of tenuous alliance, because many of the Eastern Bloc nations, like the Poles or the who else? Poland, Hungary especially, were not especially sympathetic towards the Soviet side. Like they even had the revolution in 1956, and the Red Army had to come down and crush it.
Man.
Yeah, and on a side note, this is actually something that the current Chinese Communist Party is actually very aware of, and that's why they put such an emphasis on national unity.
Okay.
Because they see the role that local nationalist movements had in bringing about the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Do you think that also plays into the whole Taiwan situation?
Yeah, of course, because China wants to exert control over every part of itself that it claims control over, and that includes Taiwan, which it's currently not able to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Now, an interesting one is, and very specific to the Soviet Union, is Marxism-Leninism, because based on what I've studied about it, it takes a very specific type of leadership that just doesn't yield to anyone. And under Stalin, they had that. It's just once Stalin was gone, every single leader after him just was a bit more willing to make concessions to the West, until eventually you're in the 1980s and 90s, where Soviet officials are just racing past each other to try to sell off as much of the country as they can.
Wow, that's sad.
So, yeah. And then, of course, you have the land versus sea dynamic, or just the democracy versus autocracy dynamic, because
Totally.
Not every democracy is very well functioning. I mean, you can just kind of look over the third world and see many failed democracies. But when democracy works, it's often a force of nature, because it taps into what people want, and it allows a nation to commit to some pretty difficult goals and still come out on top.
Okay. Wow. So those that's a lot of very tangible reasons why the U.S. would win. So then what can we take away from all these Cold War lessons?
Well, the first big one is that empires rise and empires fall. The First World War killed off the German Empire. That was the Second Reich. It killed off the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman, and actually the Russian Empire too. And then when World War II rolled around, it killed off the Japanese Empire, the Third Reich, and the Italian Empire. And over the course of the Cold War, which was set in motion by World War II, the British, the Dutch, the French, and Portugal also lost their empires. And at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union lost too. So I think that's just kind of the cycle of history. Wars end up, especially very large wars that drain the empires, eventually end up breaking them. And I think eventually the same will happen to the U.S.
I wonder what's going to happen in World War III, man. That's sad. Okay. What are some of the lessons?
Yeah. There's also the lesson that ideological struggles can be won or lost, but geopolitical struggles are much more enduring, because like the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. It's been gone for over 30 years now. But Russia is definitely not America's friend, even after it adopted many of the same systems that America did.
Yeah, that's
And I think
interesting.
that goes to show that there's a much more underlying reason for why it's not a friend of the U.S. And it's kind of the eternal enemy or rival of America. And speaking of which, China went through many capitalist reforms too. I mean, China's economy today is very capitalist, but they're also not pals with America either.
Totally.
Yeah. Also, empires can't ever truly be assured of everlasting peace and stability.
Yeah.
Global communism may have lost a bunch of its power during the course of the Cold War and afterwards, but despite that, it's been replaced by non-Western nationalists, revisionist nationalists like China, North Korea, and Russia. And it's also been replaced by radical Islamism like Iran and the Taliban and Hezbollah and Hamas.
Give me a second, dude.
So regardless of how many battles you win, there's always going to be someone who will still challenge you afterwards. And finally, the enemies of yesterday are often the recruits of today, like Japan and Germany were some of the most vicious enemies that the U.S. has ever faced. But today, they're some of America's most important allies. And vice versa, during World War II, the Soviets and the Chinese were major allies to America, but now they're America's main rivals. Another interesting one is actually that Iran was formerly an ally of the U.S., but after the revolution in 1979, Iran became one of America's harshest critics. And they've also been siding much more closely these days with China and Russia.
That would be a really interesting deep dive to do on Iran, because I'm even a little like, when did it all go wrong? Because that's really fascinating to me that they were once an ally of the U.S., because now it just seems like it's totally not the case.
It completely flipped entirely 180 degrees.
The axis of resistance.
After 79. Yeah, and of course there's also the Mujahideen, who I brought up before, because during the Soviet-Afghan War, they were America's friends, but after 9/11 they became America's enemy. So it also flips. I mean, who knows? Maybe one day Israel or India might be an enemy of the U.S. Because today they're I think India, I would say, is like a nominal U.S. ally, but in the future that may not be true, and the same is actually probably not going to be true for Israel because of how much opinion shifting against them. Yeah, or even Cuba and Venezuela might be allies one day. I mean, who really knows?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then, man, there's just so much. There's so much we could say. I even feel like if I could just throw in one thing, like I think the Cold War also had an effect on like the American psyche, right? Like all just growing up, for me at least, just hearing. Okay, here's this isn't all Cold War, but I would say that growing up, my personal experience with history is communism bad, America good. You were just taught this really dumbed down version of the Cold War, of all of this stuff that's gone down. Jesus, dude. Oh my God. Okay. And you almost don't have the capacity to think critically about the details, okay? You just laid out a lot of the pros and cons of American freedom or the Soviet Union, right? But I feel that one of the longer lasting effects of the Cold War was this Red Scare propaganda that just paints anything that's not American as secondary or bad, or that it's just to be dismissed, right? At least that's my impression that's kind of how it's been perceived on my end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that is the general consensus. But of course, like everything, it's also starting to change because I think people are starting to take a more critical look at the U.S. during the Cold War.
Then we have the internet to think about that and
exactly.
A lot of technology. Yeah, we've talked about that too, everybody. Wow.
Yeah, so for a few final thoughts on all of this, I think there's actually another interesting point to make is that in a way the Cold War didn't really end because many of the struggles that were around in the era of the Cold War are still around today. Like there's still two Koreas. I mean, the Cold War is the reason why there's World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, the reason why there's North Korea and the South Korea. And that was all the way back in the 1940s. But even today in the 2020s, those two countries are still there. And they're probably not going to get back together anytime soon.
Yeah, okay.
There's also India and Pakistan. Those are two nations that appeared really because of the end of World War II. And they were both formed during the Cold War, and they're still divided today. Israel-Palestine is actually another big example. And, of course, you also got Russia versus NATO and China versus Taiwan. So, in a way, there's still many echoes of the Cold War that are still ongoing.
There we go.
there's always going to be imperial competitors between superpowers or great powers, as long as there are enough people in the world to make these systems viable. Because it seems that as long as they're empires, they're always going to clash against each other. There's always going to be something for them to fight over.
Yeah.
There's always going to be overlapping spheres of influence that will make them arm up and get ready for war, even if it never actually arrives. But on a lighter note, I'd also say that the struggle for liberation and autonomy and freedom and independence will also never end either.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's a lot. We just went through a lot. Yeah, man. So at the end, America win, Soviet lose.
Or did they?
All right, thanks, Evan.
Thanks for listening in. You can follow us on @World History Addicts Podcast on Instagram and subscribe for new releases and episodes. Take care, and I hope you can join us again.